Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Disney, The Mighty Ducks Game Changers, Episode 7. Really, I thought that this season was over of the show. In all brutal honesty, I was like, oh, okay, well, that's wrapped up. Da, 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 da. Like, I think I'm done with this show. That's great. Like, high five, everybody. We made it through the season. And we really got a big, interesting episode within the last episode. And, like, that was a pretty decent send off. But then. We end up going back into the same old song and dance. We end up going back into episode 7, which I would say feels like a 70-30 kind of thing going on. Where, like, 30% of this episode I actually did like, I actually did enjoy. 70% of it is just a really pulverizing like episode. You have it to where there's obvious points of why you don't see these young actors in this show very often. You can really understand that blatantly. They kind of do need to rest on these veteran actors to be able to pull off any kind of performance because we really don't have it to where these younger actors are giving us anything, especially, and it really kind of hits home within this episode. Really, I have been able to seemingly predict how exactly this show is going to go from the get-go. Even the very last review of this, I immediately said, oh, okay, well, they are probably going to really just carry an entire episode via one story, and that's exactly what they did. We really have it toward the episode that I naturally assumed of which that this was going to go into. It blatantly goes into that. We end up having also Alex almost taking a back seat to coaching to where she is having Bombay pitch in a lot more because she thinks that he is just a better coach, a better teacher, a better whatever. But eventually we end up having Bombay eventually realizing that he does need Alex within this episode. And that I guess is probably really just what it is for this episode. We end up having actually a hockey seemingly game in this episode, but it's not a full-on hockey game. It's just a portion of a game. Like, I'm not saying you take an entire episode to really showcase an entire hockey game, because these actors aren't that talented, I think, in hockey, let alone in acting. And so reasonably you can just kind of give them kind of some leeway of, like, at least their the way they shot this hockey game was a lot better than previous scenes where it just feels like there is one person and goalie in an entire hockey rink. And so I could say that at least this hockey game is a shot a lot better than previous episodes. We also have it to where reasonably there is still that teaching mechanism, or we end up having like a trust fall kind of episode within the team to get their morality back, because if anything, we end up having also some stories of which that I had mentioned in previous reviews that kind of go right into this episode. It's like, man, how predictable is this show? There's nothing like that I would just say, ooh, gee golly, like, this is not something that I thought story-wise they were going to go with. And every single time I end up predicting something that's going to go on the show, because I think that this show is trying to either do some kind of fan service, or they easily know how to write this show, and so I easily understand exactly how they're going to write the show, because it's fairly easy for them to write every episode in, and so I'm predicting easily how this show is going to go. Really, the next episode might be fairly much more unpredictable, just because reasonably they didn't have a they didn't have a like a tail end to this episode that like told us exactly how exactly everything is gonna get written. There isn't like a story that's just going uh, to tell us where the next episode is gonna go. I think reasonably it's probably going to be the point of when does this hockey season actually end? Because there is no standings, there is no like we're not getting like an update of where anyone is in this league. So I'm assuming or assessing they're doing that on purpose to try and tell us that like they can try to jockey or they can try to adjust this story to be whatever it needs to be. And like it's not like the don't bothers are exactly telling us like that they're going to make the playoffs or that they're even close to be making the playoffs or that they are going to have to beat the Mighty Ducks at the very end of this season to make it to whatever to the playoffs or anything. And so like that's the kind of like okay, so where is this season going? With that said, really, I have to mention that I like the fact that it seems that they are finally giving people screen time who weren't given screen time in other episodes. I think I can like that. We end up having a character who is called Sam, who actually gets some actual screen time in this episode. And I really like the fact that they actually gave him his own screen time because I felt like he wasn't getting nearly enough. I also like the fact that we end up going in the direction that I kind of thought that this show was going to go with Evan and Sophie, so I guess I could be happy about that. But anything else was just like hockey game, hockey game, hockey game, because that's all that mattered. And that's the only thing that I actually liked. Everything else was just pure garbage and was just pure like, oh yeah, of course you're gonna write this episode that way. Of course you are. Because reasonably, uh, this show doesn't exactly have like a surprising formula into it to where you're just going like, oh, I'm shocked. I'm shocked that this episode went this way. If anything, the only thing that we could be shocked about is when the original Mighty Ducks were going to come on the show, but we knew that they were going to come on the show. So it was like a nice thing that they were on the show, but it wasn't a giant surprise that they weren't going to be on the show. And plus, we were all kind of wondering who of the Mighty Ducks were going to come back at some point. Whether it be people we'd be familiar with or people were just like, I don't remember who this is. And so on and so forth, because people might have been watching the original movie franchise along with this show, or people might have just gone in blind or whatever because they haven't seen the Mighty Ducks in so long. I at least watched the original movie, and then I'm thinking maybe after this season is finally over, maybe going back to the franchise to maybe watch the second and or third or whichever ones are left to watch. So, with that said, I've gone into this long enough. Let's go into spoilers about this episode because there really isn't much to talk about in a very cryptic-like sense with this going on. So, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I get to spoil this episode. I apologize. I think the last review was fairly long just because I had a lot to just gush and just ooh ah about because that episode was actually good compared to all the others. This episode goes right back to just going yeah plah. If the last episode was such a high note, immediately we go right back downhill. So immediately we have it within this first episode back of an actual good episode. We're back to the same old formula of garbage. We end up having it to where Evan is to go back to the team, and I can't feel that every little bit of this hurtful emotion that this entire team has against Evan is some of the most cardboardingly fake acting that I've ever seen in my life. Yeah, people like like the equivalent of their acting is just like, yeah, I'm really angry. I'm so angry at you, Evan. God, I'm so angry. Now I'm angry. Just angry. Like, everything seems really fake. Everything seems like, yeah, I hate this Evan guy. I really do. Believe me, I hate him. I hate his gods because of the betrayal that he has done to me. Everybody seemed really fake with this hateful whatever emotion that they had against Evan via him going to the Ducks. And so we end up having Sophie throwing this in his face that, well, how could you have betrayed us? How could you have gone to the Ducks when you spent so much time trying to get me to come to the Don't Bothers? How could you have done that, Evan? And Evan's like, I'm sorry. I was looking at a way better team and I was looking at going to state. And here's the more hitting factor is we end up having Sophie like mention eventually to Evan that Evan should have came to her and talked about this, and he didn't. That is the most coolest thing that we get in this story, is Sophie mentioning to Evan that Evan should have come to Sophie to talk this out, and he didn't. And like, I think that that's the best moment in this entire episode, where eventually when Evan has to talk to Sophie to kind of make amends of what all he had done and whatever, what have you. Like, we could have ended up having it to where, like, Coach T could have went to Sophie and asked her to be on the team, but he didn't. And so, like, why is it that Evan was so much better than Sophie, when really looking at it, either one of these characters could honestly be the captain of this team, and it would honestly make no difference. And so we also end up having it to where eventually Evan ends up abolishing his C upon his jersey. He ends up ripping it off and saying, like, you know what? I'm not captain now. I have to earn my C. And I'm like, oh my God, is this just going to be like the other Mighty Ducks movie where we end up having the new coach for the Mighty Ducks having to slap the C onto Evan by the very end of this? Is that what's going to happen? Just like in the one Mighty Ducks movie where eventually Charlie earns back his C, and so we end up slapping it onto his jersey to reconfirm that he is the Mighty Ducks captain because he didn't earn it, but then he had to earn it. Is that going to be the whole thing that's going to go on via the last episode of this? I feel like it's going to happen. So, because that happened before in the other Mighty Ducks movie, so they're probably going to reminisce to that. Because I know that's happening. I know that Evan is going to win back his C, and then he'll be slapped onto his chest by the game or whatever to say, like, yeah, you're the heart of this team. Here you go. Here's your C. Slap. Anyways, so going on to this movie, or going on to this episode, we end up having them doing what is called, hey, we need to just shove everybody in a room and argue all this out until eventually they just all become friends again because they're all locked in some room. We end up having some very dangerous and or weird tactics that not only both or mainly Alex ends up going to try to get this team to talk it out. We end up having Alex, who ends up taking the entire team and locking them in one room until they finally agree that they are all one team again. And we end up having Alex, who ends up just putting a chair against the door, and then she ends up just leaving. And so we end up having it to where, like, you would have thought that maybe Alex would have gone in there and try to just be like some kind of mitigator or something, but instead she's just like, oh, we'll just have them fight it out, and like they'll eventually just realize that that this is the right move. Well, Bombay ends up going and realizing that the Ice Palace has completely lost power, and that they can't even have hockey practice even if they wanted to. So they end up going and deciding to have hockey practice elsewhere, which of course we end up having Bombay, who goes into very reminiscent territory, because we end up having Bombay always needing to find himself in every single one of his Mighty Ducks movies by going into a ice rink outside and just kind of practicing and skating and whatever to go and re-find himself. Every single movie, that's when he gets his groove back. When he ends up going into an outside rink to find himself, and so we end up having Bombay taking all the kids to and like they really try to reminisce about the Mighty Duck movies, to the point of even doing the whole egg hockey stick trick, to where we end up having it to where we have the kids go on the ice, and so we end up having Bombay, who ends up having some time with Coop, because it seems that Coop has really good hands for a goalie now, but it seems like his feet work are just really lacking. And so we end up having Bombay having to forcibly take Coop to supposedly a thinner part of the ice rink, and to tell him that the ice is going to crack, is going to fall. And so then surprisingly we have Coop, who runs skating wise just like a million miles an hour onto the opposite side of the ring and jumps into the snow. And then Bombay's like, aha, I got you. And I'm like, like, so in other words, like, this guy needs to just be told that the ice is thin consistently, or there's a werewolf after him, so that way he can move his feet a lot more, because this goalie is just, it is what it is. Sure, whatever. I did whatever with that. I just thought that was kind of silly, and I didn't understand why they had to have that in the show, I guess, to try to train somebody on how to be a better goalie or whatever. It's like, I'm sorry, you're not teaching this goalie how to do like the splits or anything or whatever, to like try to make sure that he's able to like dodge everywhere. Like, you would think trying to make this goalie a lot more flexible would have been one thing, to just be like, hey, Coop, I'm going to take you to a yoga class so you can kind of like really stretch yourself out and really be able to like do the splits to try to like get some goals out of the way and whatever, and like be more flexible. I think that would have been really cool. But then again, doing the splits, like, I'm sure, like, who would want to do that? But if anything, it's a smart strategy. So, anyways, going on into now having Bombay do the egg the egg trick, the egg thing, where we end up having these hockey players tossing their phones back and forth to one another on the ice, because evidently Bombay didn't want to use eggs because he ended up getting hit with eggs before. So now everybody is actually using their phones. And so we end up having these guys tossing back and forth their phones. Everybody's like, whoever is really dependent on their phone is just like, oh my God, like, that is like a ton of allowance. Or Coop is ultimately saying like, well, hey, like, take it easy with her. And so we end up having both of these people tossing their phones back and forth. I hope they heavily crack it. I hope they heavily just broke a phone, because I would just be in utter horror of that moment. And then, like, especially if it was Coop's phone and how he had to not rely on his phone anymore, would be an amazing story that they should have gone with, but they didn't. That's what they should have done, but they didn't. But anyways, we also have it to where Alex does yet another bizarre-like strategy to get this team to work together, but not really. We end up having Alex, who ends up deciding to blindfold her entire hockey team. And I'm like, this is an insane strategy. I'm like, somebody's gonna take a skating blade to the face, and I'm like, no, like this is horrifying. And so I'm waiting for somebody to fall and for someone to get hurt. Like this scene makes no sense. I don't care if it was some kind of strategy for them to be having this being used for this hockey game that they ended up doing. I don't care. This looks dangerous. I think that was an insane thing to do to blindfold everybody, and I didn't get that whatsoever. Plus, we could say that they were choreographed to fall certain ways, I think, some of these kids. But reasonably, a lot of this was probably like choreographed to the T to have these kids easily be able to do this scene. But I also thought that it was stupid. I was like, this is dangerous. These kids are on blades, and that's what I was thinking the whole entire time. Is somebody was probably going to get hurt, and that's all I cared about. Uh, but anyways, so we end up having Alex who ends up trying to blindfold these people, and we end up having Bombay just going, okay, sure, go ahead, like try this, try to get the puck in the goal. And so they end up trying to do it, and then everyone ends up like falling on their faces. So and a lot of them don't even know exactly where the puck is, so they're just trying to like figure out where the puck is, and they end up falling on the ground. They end up falling on themselves basically. So cue us going into now the hockey game. It seems that Alex is taking much more of a back seat of coaching, letting Bombay go and do her thing. We end up having Alex coming up with the idea of blindfolding her team from her boss because it seems that Alex and her boss kind of had a talk together about like what she should kind of do about how like she uses like her boss uses certain kind of training to be able to figure things out or what, I don't know. That scene just didn't matter to me. So pushing on, so we end up having the hockey game, and so we end up having a referee shouting out to Bombay and Alex because I guess he figures that those two are the actual coaches of this team. And so he's like, well, hey, man, like, is there a coach to this team? Because we end up having Bombay who ends up sitting next to Alex, and Alex is like, well, hey, like, aren't you going to go out there? Like, aren't you the coach for the Don't Bothers? And Bombay is like, you know what? Like, yeah, I am the assistant coach. But really, I learned that the power wasn't taken down by accident. I purposely took down the power to shift all these kids to go onto that rink. And I learned that from you, Alex. I learned it from you. So you're the heart of this team, Alex. Here's your C. And like, you need to go out there and you need to teach these people because I think that they're going to learn a lot from you. And I'm also going to learn a lot. So we end up having Bombay having this moment of just telling Alex in one way or another that like she needs to be the coach for this team. And so I also think that Bombay kind of said that because reasonably, like, we need to have certain people like mean something within this show, and it's not like Bombay is just going to start taking control. No, like he has to say that Alex is still an important factor to this team, and so on and so forth. So we end up having Alex going out and coaching this team, and it seems that things are going the way they're going. We also have it to where I guess we should mention the other parts. So Sam was really distraught by Evan leaving this team to the point of him just not even wanting to go to practice anymore, not even wanting to be a part of the Don't Bothers anymore. And so I didn't really want to go into this just because it's like a horrible, like, kind of scene. but I like the fact that they actually gave this person camera time. Because overall, it looks just shot like, that's my guy, and I'm like, that just, yeah. So we end up having the boys go off to see Sam, who had fallen off of caring about being on the Don't Bothers, and so we end up having Evan and Nick and I think Coop all confronting Sam about why exactly he doesn't want to be interested in being a part of the team anymore. And Sam says, well, like, I just don't think that I can be that extreme guy anymore. I just don't think that I can, I just don't think that I can really just, I just felt that with Evan leaving off of this team, like, I just don't think that I can really just be on this team anymore, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having the guys end up rallying around Sam to just like, well, dude, like, you're the only, like, real, like, crazy person that's on this team. You're the only risk taker that's on this team. Like, if anything, you're going to make us all better just because of you just going off and doing all these crazy stunts. And so, like, Sam, you're the heart of this team and we need you on this team. And Sam is like, well, yeah, I guess you're right. And so we end up having Sam, who immediately tries to do some kind of stunt of sorts. And we end up having him, like, basically, like, smashing into this barrel. And we end up having Evan going, that's my guy. And so we end up having Sam going up and like, yeah, I did something extreme. Because we end up having Sam, who loves to go and grind with his skateboard and whatever. And I guess, like, him not having Evan on this team. Like, it was a weird way about them trying to skate around the fact that Sam doesn't have a really good enough reason for why he ended up trying to go away from this team, and they had to figure out some goofy reason that didn't exactly sell to me. But nothing really sold to me in a bulk of this episode. So, was there anything else that I've forgotten? Because there's a lot of just stuff going on here within the... Okay, let's go to the hockey game because I think I covered everything. If I didn't, then it probably wasn't important enough. So, hockey game. So, we end up having it seemingly a pretty close game as per usual. And so, we end up having Alex, who has to coach this team, is like, hey, man, you know what? I think I have a really good strategy. How about we go and we do the blindfolded, play? How about we do the blindfolded play? And we end up having a couple of the team that are like, oh my god, do not put bandanas on us again. And we end up having Alex going, no, that's not what I mean. And so we end up having all the entire Don't Bothers team going out to the hockey rink, and we end up having them starting their matchup, and we end up having every single one of the Don't Bothers closing their eyes, to where the other team ends up getting really weirded out. And one of the people even stand up and like, dude, this guy's closing his eyes. And so it's like, meh, whatever. Like, I don't care. Like, the referee is just like, yeah, just, so what? Like, let's play. And so we seemingly end up having Evan eventually tossing it to Sophie, and then Sophie ends up tossing it, and, like, they continue to just kind of, like, toss it around and whatever, and then eventually they end up, I guess, knowing exactly where the net is, to where they end up just slap-shotting it in, and it goes in and they score. And I'm like, okay, I guess, so you don't have to really be good at hockey, you just have to be a hockey. Hey, they're shooting blind! Dude, the other team should have just easily taken the puck from them, because they easily could have, and then they could have scored onto the other goal, because the other people wouldn't have known. They would have been blindfolded, they would have had their eyes closed. That other team was dumb. Like, they could have just easily just been like, well, we're just going to take this puck from these people, and, like, I don't care. They could have easily just smashed into them and just like, that sucks to be you. We're going to take this puck. See you later. Bye. We also had the moment where Evan and Sophie end up talking to one another. That was a really important moment. we end up having Evan who ends up talking to Sophie, and we end up having Evan making amends that he didn't go to Sophie, and we end up having Evan saying how important Sophie is to him, and we end up having Evan giving Sophie a knee brace for her troubles, to where it's just like making amends, but it's just okay. It is what it is. There is no romance there or anything like that. It's just like, yeah, I guess we're still gonna be friends. Like, it seems like they're trying as much as possible to make it seem like those two people are important to one another, but that's not good enough. It really is. It's just like they're trying to do these like goofy things story wise to make it seem like these people are going to end up together, but it's really just kind of garbage at this point. Like, why not just do it? Just pull the trigger on those two people. But whatever, I guess. So going on into here, like, yeah, that is basically the end of this episode, where we end up having them win, and huzzah, huzzah, they won. And so recently, that's all that exactly matters. I don't think there's anything else that happens story wise. So I need to otherwise get out of here. So goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.